Good evening. You're watching The Digital Age, and I am James Goodale. You know, Barack Obama wants us to have very high-speed internet. And he, in his stimulus package, has provided a big hunk of money so that can happen. It's like $7 billion. But will it happen? Does the plan make any sense? Or is it just a cyber bridge to nowhere? Here to discuss that question with us tonight is Craig Moffett, who is, let me get your title right here, Senior VP and Senior Analyst, Sanford Bernstein. I would think that Craig has got to be one of the nation's leading experts, not on just speed, but on telecom. He's testified before Congress. Anyone who's written his, or who's had the opportunity to read his reports know that they are, without any question, unequaled anywhere.
Thank you for saying that. I appreciate it.
Okay, so let's get into this. I think we got to, before we get into exactly what Obama is doing, we got to ask ourselves, you know, are we so far behind that we need high speed?
Well, look, here's the concept, right? Let's try to provide a broadband infrastructure very similar to the rural electrification projects of the early part of the last century. That there is a very clear, and I think probably directionally correct view that says that having broadband infrastructure is an engine for economic growth. All that's fine, and I agree with all of that. The question is when you dig down into the numbers and say, how much of the country doesn't really have access to broadband? The answer is actually relatively small. There's about 8% of the country that doesn't have available broadband infrastructure, is rural America. The hard part is, now, first of all, we don't know for sure how big that 8% is. Is it 8 or is it 10 or is it 6 or is it 14? Because we don't have any good measurements right now for where broadband is available and where we don't. That's one of the things that the stimulus plan makes money available for. It allocates $350 million for what is essentially million with an M.
Oh, million?
Million with an M.
Well, we don't even care about that.
But that's just for the inventory project.
Oh, the inventory project.
That's just saying, you know, where do we have it and where don't we? Which I suppose is an admirable thing to know, right? If you're going to try to direct funds to the places where you don't, it kind of helps to know where you don't. So there's about $350 million for that. There is in total about $7.2 billion, so another $6.9 billion or $6.8 billion that's set aside for providing broadband infrastructure. Some of it for schools and libraries, some of it for community colleges and things, but a big chunk of it for rural America and for underserved markets. The question is, you know, to your point, are we really behind the rest of the world or not? The places where we rank behind, where you hear that we're 14th in the world in broadband infrastructure and falling it further and further behind, every one of those is, if you actually look at them on a map, they're about the size of the state of New Jersey individually. So we aren't behind any meaningful geographically size. Some of them have high population.
Maybe the small countries were behind?
Most of them are geographically small countries, and they have very high density. Or something? Well, some of Finland and places like that, where they can have high penetration, or parts of South Korea where there is very high density in urban markets, and the government subsidizes broadband very heavily. There are very high-speed connections. I think there's a very interesting and big question here, though, which is we're directing a huge amount of money. $7 billion, after all, isn't chump change. It's not obvious that it's enough to get it built, but it's not chump change. We're allocating $7 billion to try to fill a hole of 8% of the country that doesn't have broadband. What about the 30% of the country that does have broadband and hasn't taken it yet?
Hasn't taken it yet.
Hasn't taken it yet. We've got about 65% of the households in the country that have broadband available have signed up. 35% haven't. What about them? What are we doing to address the reasons why broadband is available but isn't subscribed to? You know, I remember a couple of years back there was a big project in Philadelphia was going to build a Wi-Fi network for the whole
we got to
city.
say what Wi-Fi means.
Wi-Fi is a wireless access technology, like the one. A lot of people will have a Wi-Fi router in their house, and it's very similar to that, just doing it outdoors on a bigger scale.
So that's when, for example, you have the cable company brings in the cable into your TV set in your living room, but you want to put it upstairs.
That's right.
And you don't have to do another cable connection.
Exactly. You do a Wi-Fi connection and you have it across your house. And
or if you go in a hotel.
Starbucks.
Starbucks.
Those sorts of, those are Wi-Fi connections. Philadelphia was going to build a Wi-Fi connection or a Wi-Fi network for the entire city, and they were going to make it available at low cost to lower income Philadelphians. Well, an admirable project, I suppose, but it sort of presumes that the reason that people in Philadelphia that were lower income didn't have broadband was because they either couldn't afford the broadband connection or they didn't have physical access to broadband because it wasn't built in their neighborhood. But that sort of, in turn, presumes that they're sitting there with Centrino-powered laptops just waiting for a connection to come along.
They may not even
That's
have
just
a laptop.
not realistic.
They may not even have a laptop, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And so, you know, some of the things that we've written in the past about broadband availability, I think that are sobering when you think about them is, you know, for all the talk about how we lag other countries in broadband, we lag other countries a lot more in literacy rates, for example. Now, what the hell are you going to do with a broadband connection if you can't read? I mean, I suppose you can eventually use it for...
Let me just think about it. If you can't read... well, they're the people that aren't going to... I mean, those are the people in Philadelphia, but most people read in Philadelphia. Well, those are the people who didn't take it, probably.
There are a lot. I mean, by some estimates, our country, you know, is certainly among the OECD countries, is the furthest behind in literacy rates. We have the highest poverty levels because we have very wide income distribution. So among developed Western world countries, particularly Europe, we have higher poverty levels than almost any other country. So there are big structural impediments that go way beyond just have the company strung the wires to people's houses yet.
Yeah, you've talked about availability. I wonder if we just take a step back and talk about speed, because our viewers out there may be interested in speed, or they may not be. And they get confused, as I do, as to what is fast and what isn't fast. Now, you said in terms of availability that 30% of the populace hasn't even taken high speed. And my question to you now is, how high is high speed?
How high is high, yeah.
And I wonder if we could just talk about simple numerical standards.
Sure.
I'll just give you an example. Actually, I'm a rural subscriber to high-speed broadband. I live in the smallest town in Connecticut, and after great trouble, by the way, it's another thing when you fix up these rural areas, it's not easy to do because your level of competency goes down the further you get away from the city, but that's another question. But anyway, I've got it, and conveniently enough, which is not true in New York City, where I also live, I get a little sign there. It tells me how fast it's going.
Right.
And it says it's going 1 meg.
Yes.
And then I say to myself, well, that's a lot better than when I had the phone, because that was going, you know, how much? 30 times less, 300 times less?
200 times less.
200
probably,
times.
yeah.
I said, well, that's pretty good. But then I see this guy, Craig Moffett, and all the stuff he's writing about, and I come to the conclusion that 1 meg isn't very fast at all.
Well, Jim, you're talking about a moving target, right? This is if you went back 5 years ago. I mean, let's start from the dial-up progression. I'm old enough to remember having a first 96 baud connection, as they called it, which was 9.6 kilobits per second, and
9.6.
And then you got to 28.8 modems, and then the standard speed for dial-up modems topped out at about 56 kilobits per second,
Right.
56.6 kilobits per second. And that was really the standard, and still is the standard if you're a dial-up customer. And there still are dial-up
And some of these
customers.
people, by the way, in the rural areas, maybe dial-up
That's right.
customers.
A lot of them are dial-up customers.
Because they just go over the phone. You got to explain
over the
the
phone
audience.
line,
They're
yeah.
just going over the phone, And the phone doesn't take, generally speaking, doesn't take high speed. You got to have cable, you got to have DSL or whatever.
Now let's think about the broadband technologies. And broadly speaking, there are three of them. There is the cable modem connection. And when cable modems first started in the mid-1990s, they started at its speeds of about 1 megabit per second. So
if
you had a cable modem a good 10, 11 years ago, you probably already had a 1 megabit per second connection. Today, the average cable modem standard speed is somewhere between 8 and 12 megabits per second for what you get when you sign up for cable modem service. And the cable operators...
Can I just stop you on that? Because I want to come back to the personal. I want to personalize what you're saying. If you say 8 to 12 megs, and then what I get on my screen, it says 1 meg, and you know what people can do, I don't know if everyone realizes, but anyone who's watching this show, you go on their computer, let's say you go to Google, say, how fast is my computer running, and you get a speed.
That's
okay,
right.
so I went on I did that in New York, and it said 2 meg. It's not 8 to 12. So I want to ask you why the difference there. But then it said upload speed and download speed were less than 1 meg. So what is my speed?
Well,
and why isn't it 8 to 12?
Well, now let's before I get into that, let me just finish with the technologies, because each one is different. But the cable technologies we'll come back to in a second. Although they offer much higher speeds in general than the telephone company technologies, they're shared media. That is, everyone in your neighborhood is sharing the same connection. The more people who are using it, the slower it is for each one. In general, then, you'll get higher speeds with a cable modem than you will with a phone company connection with DSL, but not always. The DSL connection, which DSL stands for Digital Subscriber Line.
Right.
It is effectively running very high frequencies over the existing copper infrastructure. So what they call in the industry twisted pair, or a couple of filaments of copper that are not much thicker than a human hair. And the best you're going to get out of a DSL connection, short of new architectures that are yet another category that we'll come to in a minute, the best you'll get out of a DSL connection is typically 1 to 1.5 megabits per second today. I mean, that's about as high as it gets. But it is largely constant. Whether everybody in your neighborhood is using it or whether nobody in your neighborhood is using it, you'll get pretty much the same speed. And then for the truly rural areas, there is satellite broadband, which is relatively unusual, but and fairly expensive, because you need a satellite dish and special receiving equipment and that sort of thing. And the speeds tend to be significantly slower, usually well under 1 megabit per second. But in lots of truly rural markets, it's all you can get. So now, as I said,
what I mean, but this is terrific, because we've lined up satellite less than 1, DSL about 1.
And the cable
But you didn't tell me the answer to the cable question. I want to line that number up too, because you said the speed goes down when most people are turning it on at the same time. So what would one ordinarily expect that number to be?
Typically, on average, throughout all the parts of the day, the average cable modem subscriber is getting between 4 and 6 today.
Well, why? I don't understand why I'm not.
Well, some of the time it's because the cable operators will sell lower tiered services for lower prices, and they will effectively give you a modem that limits the amount of speed that you can get from it.
So maybe I've got the wrong modem.
So you could call them and say you want a higher speed. In some cases, particularly in rural markets, and it may be the case in your particular cable system, the distances and the splices. Remember, a lot of the splices that were done, literally taking two pieces of coaxial cable and splicing them together somewhere in the field 20 years ago, are low enough quality that there is sufficient loss in the pipe that the speed that you get is lower. That's generally not a major issue for cable operators, because the coaxial cable, remember I described the phone infrastructure as
the phone wire
twisted pair that's sort of the thickness of a human hair.
Right.
The coaxial cable is about the thickness of your finger. It's a much higher capacity physical infrastructure. And so, but over distances and under certain poor deployment conditions, even cable modem service is going to be relatively low speed. DSL, by the way, is much more sensitive to distances than cable is.
Okay, so let me just stop you so I can sum up, because we've got less than one, we've got a little bit more than one, and we've got 4 to 6, and you've just said at 4 to 6 that is relatively slow. So what do you think of being fast?
Well, it depends. The FCC defined broadband back in the late 1990s and all the way up through last year as 200 kilobits per second. Now, nobody would define 200 kilobits per second as broadband anymore. Last year, they raised that, I believe it was last May, they raised that to 768 kilobits per second.
That's nonsense.
Still not broadband.
I mean, it's 4 to,
right?
Yeah.
The cable operators right now are deploying a new technology which goes by the marketing unfriendly name of DOCSIS 3.0, although they are now at least giving it
of course, all the other stuff is market friendly that we've been talking about,
well,
right?
they're giving it the college try of calling it wideband. So going
see.
from broadband to wideband, I'm not sure that really is very evocative for people, but wideband will offer up to 160 megabits per second.
160 M.
160 M. So
wait a minute, we've gone from 4 to 6,
to
which I'm supposed to be getting, to 160.
Right.
Now what? But
now initially they'll price it very high.
okay, but let me just ask you a quick question, because Obama says we need more high speed here. Are you talking about a variety of different speeds? You just gave me one of 140, 160 megs. What do you think? What do you think Obama means when he says high speed?
Well,
when you talk about
knows.
High speed, what are you talking about?
Remember, James, what we're fundamentally talking about here, a concept that is the field of dreams concept, that if you build it, they will come. And the idea that we're going to go from 4 to 6, or today most cable operators will actually sell you a tier up to 16 megabits already without any service upgrade. So that's the existing infrastructure. So 16 times faster than what the
But when we talk about those little countries like Finland, and everyone says Finland's got high speed,
a lot of them will run fiber all the way to the house.
Okay,
and will often offer.
But what's the speed in Finland?
The typical speed that they will offer is between 50 and 100 megabits per second.
And 50 or 100.
But theoretically,
that's got to be what Obama's talking about.
Well, perhaps. The problem right now is you get a chicken or the egg problem, right? The concept was originally that if you create broadband, that is where we are today, the somewhere between 1 and 5 megabits per second, say, for most broadband users. If you create broadband, new applications will emerge to use it, and that's exactly what's happened. If you got a broadband connection 8 or 9 years ago, there was no YouTube. You couldn't watch your show on the internet. Today you can, and that requires significantly more bandwidth than the things that you used to do 7 or 8 years ago. The question is, what are we going to do 5 years from now that consumes 50 to 100 megabits per second? It's not, I think, as easy as saying, well, if you build it, they will come, because we always find ways to use broadband. Right. There are multiple pieces of this puzzle that have to fit together. The processing speed of the computer, the infrastructure and the capacity of the internet backbone, the capacity of the web servers that serve the websites, the picture quality and the number of lines of resolution of your television set. All of those things are part of an ecosystem that say it's not hard to imagine you could easily get well ahead of bandwidth demand by deploying too much bandwidth.
But let's now go. So we went way out there. I want to come back.
Come back to reality.
Let's come back to Obama and this plan, because we didn't talk about wireless. But I will just move the conversation along. Would have thought that wireless does about 1 to 2 megs.
Not quite. Today, under real-world conditions, it's probably significantly less than that.
Okay.
It's possible on a 3G network, as they call it. So if you have an iPhone and you're on a 3G network, with a good signal, you're getting 1 to 2 megs.
Okay. So now we've got these choices. We've got various speeds for the telephone, for wireless, for satellite, for cable. And the highest is 4. And Obama says now, look, we want to bring high speed, whatever that means. Seems to me we're not talking about very high speed, but tell me if you just, but we're going to bring high speed to the rural areas. Now I want to ask you, how does that happen, and what sort of speed do we bring?
Good question.
That's why I had you on the program, because is it a cyber bridge to nowhere?
So in the original drafts, the Senate draft in particular of the stimulus plan, there were two very clearly defined categories. There was current generation broadband and next generation broadband. And the next generation broadband assumed 100 megabits per second or better. All that language was abandoned in the final bill.
And they sort of
conference.
the money went out as in terms of the speed you got.
That's right.
But that's all gone, and now the money goes out to the Agriculture Department and someplace else. Right?
Some of it goes to the Department of Agriculture. Some of it goes to the NTIA or the Telecommunications and Information Administration. I think, is probably improved from the original drafts in the sense that it is now better targeted toward the rural areas, which, irrespective of whether you think that's the right idea or not, that was what they were trying to do. So at least it's likely to be more successful in getting the money into the rural areas. But there was never an economic case, even with subsidies of $7 billion, to start deploying infrastructure to rural areas that was going to do 100 megabits per second.
So I think there's two questions here when we get this far along the trail. One is whether it's an economic stimulus or not. And I'd just like soon just put that aside for the moment, because my question is, I don't understand what exactly, if you've got all this money, you're trying to do. Are you trying to help the satellite operator? Are you trying to help the cable operator? The cable operator, you said, was out there 94% of the country, but cable operator doesn't want to go to the rural areas. He just sits on his hands. Is it going to be telephone companies who've got a faster DSL? No, because they can't have a faster DSL. Will it be the telephone companies that are doing something else, like taking broadband in? Or is it going to be, I mean, you're sitting there now, for example, in the Department of Agriculture. What is it you're planning to do? Or maybe the better question is, suppose you were appointed by Obama to spend this money. What would you do?
Well,
that's a good question.
It's a good question, and let me start with one incredibly important point that I think, and every time I talk to people in Washington and when I engage in these public policy debates, I'm always struck by the complete absence of consideration for whether or not these projects actually earn an acceptable return on invested capital. It's an incredibly important question that unfortunately is always left out of the debate in public policy circles.
But aren't they going to subsidize it? So that isn't.
Well, subsidizing it helps.
It's a good question, but they're going to say.
Well, no, they're not. $7 billion isn't enough to build it. $7 billion is enough to help give grants that will help offset some of the cost.
Oh, I see.
But you still have to have a return on invested capital. There has to be an economic return for somebody to build one of these systems. And I think there is a tremendous desire in the technology community to say, well, I want it built and I want it to be free after it's finished. Well, that's just not a realistic expectation.
But I want to come back to this because let's take a look at any particular rural community. Who are you going to give the money to among the people that I've talked about? Are you going to give it to the cable operator to string it out, or are you going to give it to satellite? To whom would you give them?
In the rural communities, I think practically speaking, it's going to end up with the telephone companies, and there are a number and there's a number of reasons for that.
The telephone companies.
With the telephone companies, and that means that you're likely to see DSL connections. Now, what you have to do technologically in order to get DSL out to rural areas is you probably have to run fiber very far out toward the houses and then run copper, so that the copper link that they run DSL
Okay, but now let's
long.
Remind the audience what you said earlier. DSL is, for all practical purposes, an inferior technology.
That's right.
Because it doesn't, it runs, well, I think you said 1 meg or something like that.
You're typically going to see speeds
in Finland, they're doing 50 meg. Okay, so now if in fact you've now decided, as you're the czar, to give the money to the telephone companies, and they say they're going to use this DSL thing, what have you created? You've created an inferior. You haven't created high speed. You've created low speed.
Here's exactly the problem, right? Here's exactly the problem. It would be great if we had a fiber running into every single home in America. In fact, what most people actually want, whether they realize it or not, is they suggest we ought not to have one, we ought to have two. We ought to have one coming from the cable company and one coming from the phone company, and they're competed out for the customer's wallet, and therefore prices would be very low. Well, that's a wonderful ambition to have, but it's not conceivably possible from an economic point of view. Verizon is the only company in the United States that is building a meaningful size fiber network.
But a really high speed. We're not talking about a high, but you're talking about DSL, which Verizon could deliver as an alternate technology. And as a matter of fact, it seems to me, I remember reading one of your reports that you said that in the long run you think DSL is bye-bye.
I think DSL
is bye-bye. But now I put you in the agriculture department, and you spent the money on DSL, and DSL is you mean I have a terrific conflict of interest if you had to spend it, because you've written a report saying it's bye-bye.
It's exactly right. This is the dilemma that we face, right? And I come right back to this question of where does return on invested capital come into this equation? Because the problem is, if I've already got a telephone infrastructure that goes out to these houses, and a lot of it was built, it was effectively built and paid for in the last depression, right? Some of this is the vestiges of a universal service obligation that's almost 100 years old.
The rurals have all of this because in the old days they had to do it, and this is sort of the analogy, as you said at the top of the program.
But now that basic infrastructure is still the infrastructure that the telephone companies use for DSL. And it's the only infrastructure that's there. So either you're going to go out and build a greenfield plant, which is start from scratch and start putting shovels in the ground.
You're not going to do that.
You're not going to do that for $7 billion.
Okay, so basically what you're saying is, if you look at what's out there, you got all these rural homes, and all the homes in America have got a phone connection. And they've got a phone connection because we had a policy where we subsidized the rural things. Okay, so I've made you in the agriculture department. You're sitting there, hey, it's already built. So what I'm going to do is I'll just add this little gadget called DSL on top of what's already there, and that's the best return on investment. But what is it the best? Let's talk about the thing I didn't want to talk about. Is it the best economic? No, is it the best economic stimulus?
Well, here's
or would it be better to
let's think about practically the way it's going to work, right? The way this is going to work is the grant administrator is going to accept proposals.
Yeah.
The proposals, for all the complexities that the proposals are going to entail, these proposals require, for example, that you can demonstrate that the technology works, that the vendors that are being are being used are
all right. Now, guess what?
That's going to go to the phone companies.
We've come to the end, and you've got this proposal, and you're sitting there. Do you conclude, looking at this proposal that you've just received in the example, that it is, in effect, a cyber bridge to nowhere? Yes or no, Craig Moffett?
No, I wouldn't call it a cyber bridge to nowhere.
Okay.
But look,
I just have to shake your hand.
What Barack Obama said is a stimulus plan is effectively spending money.
Okay.
We'll spend money. The goal is that broadband is going to stimulate the economy and that it creates economic growth. Some broadband is better than no broadband, and unfortunately, that's all that the return on investment is going to provide.
Thank you very much for coming by.
James, thank you for having me.
And thank you very much for coming by, and come by next week and learn more about the digital age. For the digital age, I am James Goodale. Good night, and please have a good week.